All right. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here discussing an important topic about transatlantic interest and competition. And I think we're very pleased and blessed with having a most distinguished and most experienced panel on this topic. I think the time is kind of right because European Union just went through its election and a new commission has been sort of chosen that needs to be confirmed through the parliament. And the United States will be going through its election later next month or a little after that. And then when you have the two new administrations, the issues, global issues of competitions and adversaries and threats and interest, they will be forefront on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's a good time to discuss how best we identify them and sort of frame them so that continues this transatlantic solidarity that we have enjoyed over the last 70 years, which has been a tremendous source of positive power and action on the world for both peace and prosperity. So as we have the issues in Ukraine war, as we are dealing with issues within the Middle East, the Gaza and Israel issues, and as we have issues in China and South China issues and threats to Taiwan, I think it's a good time to discuss what are the very clear core shared interest transatlantic, and in that context, how best we may manage our competition that we also have between our two entities. To that end, I'll go around this way and have some opening comments and some back and forth. So I'll start with Minister Teek Rizala, who is a dear friend of mine and for United States. He was just the Minister of Economy and Technology in Estonia. So, sir, it'd be great to hear from your thoughts on how best we navigate these times in front of us. Over to you.
Yes, now let's start with a philosophical note. I think the not going into the technical details right now, but what I guess we both need on both sides of Atlantic is a little bit more of self-confidence. And what our adversaries do, they just communication-wise play a simple game, and they try to resonate with our people, our citizens, and they try to depict it as we have lost the control, the establishment or whoever it is, and we lack the meaning. And I think we face this on both sides of Atlantic. And meantime, there is a lot at stake in the world. So the first thing I think we have to do, if we sort of also get this new governments and governing structures into place, is prove that they're wrong, that it's absolutely contrary, that this, what you mentioned, to have been building for 75 years, it is still needed. These values are needed globally, not only for our citizens. So this is sort of the main first point I want to make.
Well, let me take off. That's a brilliant point. I think the issue that there needs to be confidence and conviction in the good that the transatlantic partnership has done and how best to make sure that it is reaffirmed and repurposed as we go forward. I think few people have worked on it stronger than Gunnar Wiegand, my good friend there. He was leading the Asia portfolio in the European External Action Service. He was the key player in coming up with the European Union sort of Asia Connectivity Initiative in line with the Indo-Pacific strategy, the Indo-Pacific effort. So how do you see it, Gunnar, as we go forward in this line?
I think it is important in this time that we are clear that, as the minister just said, that there are common values which should keep us together. And these are certainly linked to democracy, to rule of law, to civil liberties, individual freedoms. And these are representing aspirations of the majority of people in the world, whatever the systems are under which they work. And we have to live up also to those values in our own societies. It is the common basis which we have. It's the common basis also of our formal alliance, which is NATO. As European Union and as US, we are, of course, economic, strong partners, but also competitors. We are highly integrated, our markets, We have the largest trade and investment relationship when taking together trade in goods, in services, and in investment. But that doesn't mean that we always act together when it comes to third countries. And here, I guess that the common challenge we have is that we are seeing competitors who are then seen by some also as strategic rivals or systemic rivals, who are using means which are definitely not means of market economy, but use all means to defeat the other. And this is something which we have to tackle in much better ways together, and which we haven't done sufficiently so far.
Thanks a lot. Let me move over to Poland. I think Poland is literally now one of the most important security pillars in NATO on the eastern front of Europe. I think has been a true leader on issues related to Ukraine and things that we have. I think I'd appreciate from your side, and also I think it's important to mention the kind of leader on the defense spending as well within Europe, and in some ways even more than the United States. So as we see a growing sort of convergence and alignment amongst our adversaries with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, at the same time, I think it behooves us to look at how can we strengthen our grouping and not be sort of distracted by some sort of, various calls that either America should be focused on Indo-Pacific, not so much in Europe. In Europe, the discussions are that whether Russia is a threat, but China is far away. I think Poland is in the right place to sort of guide us how best to address this issue and strengthening the alliances that we've had.
Well, I don't know whether Poland is particularly, a good one to lead anyone in transatlantic community. The first point I would like to make is that, however, I agree that in 2022, Poland led, in shaping the common transatlantic response to what had happened. I mean, Russian aggression in Ukraine. So I would even say that it was Russia and Putin who made us a leader in that particular moment. This point would lead me to the following thought. We should all try to avoid the similar scenario in the Pacific. So our common deterrence against Russia failed, and now we need to assist Ukraine in its defensive war against Russia. Can we do it alone or separately? Can we deter China acting, without coherent strategy on both sides of the pond? Perhaps, but definitely we would be much more effective working together. There is a common cause on both sides of the pond to prevent a major war in the Pacific. That's one thing. Another thing is, of course, that we would be much more effective in achieving this end if we maintain our technological end and our technological advantage over China. So again, it's another stimulus, another incentive to do what we can to overperform China in technology. Marco Draghi published a huge report about where Europe is now in this competitive world. And I would like to quote one sentence from this report, because it would help us to understand the challenge. Europe must profoundly refocus its collective efforts on closing the innovation gap with the US and China, especially in advanced technologies. The difference is that, as I fully agree, United States is our ally. United States is one may say a guardian of the peace around the world. So there is a let's say huge difference between our relations with China and our competition with China and on technology, and with the United States. With the United States we can cooperate. With the United States we can make an alliance. With the United States we can be stronger.
I appreciate that. Mikko, let me come to you. I think you've had kind of one of the leading think tanks in Europe, Merix, that just focus on the sort of realpolitik, a certain amount of realism within European thinking. And I like to sort of pick up from where Slami talked about Europe finds itself in this time, in a way, trying to play catch-up in economic innovation and other ways, both with the United States and with China, as was quoted in the Mario Draghi report. I think Europe has sort of an issue going forward as to saying, okay, in future of European economic prosperity and growth, how best to strategically align and compete with the United States and with China. So when you read that paragraph in isolation, it appears that Europe is saying, I'm treating China and US the same way, I've got to close my gap. But that's obviously not the context or the purpose. So I think it'd be useful from your perspective as to, if you were talking to an American audience, how best to read that paragraph for an American audience. I'd love to hear that from you. Yeah.
Thank you, Kosh. I think no one in Europe is equidistant anymore. I think that time is over. And the more we see the resonance and the interlinkages between the different theaters that are currently keeping everyone busy, the more it is clear that Europe has found its place, I think, much closer maybe to the Americans than it was the case just a few years ago. But we also have a shared responsibility and challenge, which is to make globalization work and not to deglobalize. And that is, I think, at the center of our joint agenda. In addition to the security dimension, it's ensuring prosperity and competitiveness. And there it is upon us to make sure that our trade policy actually works to our shared interests. And that is a big challenge. And at this very moment, our assessment is we have a risk that the global trade order is too fragile and fragmenting to deliver on what we all need. And the next administration, but also obviously the European Commission, will have to make sure that we work together across the Atlantic to make sure this technology and trade future is one that we write together. And on that front, I think Europeans have come also to a growing recognition that many of China's practices and behaviors actually undermine our future prosperity. And that is a good basis, I think, to start that conversation renewed as we move forward.
So building off that, Pete, you've been in the most important offices and rooms to discuss our economic policy under President Biden. I think from the European perspective, I think it's a legitimate question to us on our side that, what is our approach on economic competition managing vis-a-vis China? And what role do we think Europe can play, an effective role? And how do we make sure that by playing that particular role that Europe would play in our sort of suggested, that would actually be beneficial for Europe, not harmful for them to be playing that particular role, and sort of aiding with that. So I think this sort of a thinking, I don't know if it's quite there in either Trump or Biden administration, but it's certainly I think a necessary point to have a more strategic alignment or cooperation going forward. So I appreciate your thoughts on that, Pete.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here on this panel. And I'll make a couple of comments about why I think it is in Europe's interest to cooperate with the U.S. here, and why I think the U.S. very much sees it is in our interest to cooperate with Europe. First, just to make sort of a very, very basic point, I don't think that the U.S. is going to be able to achieve our economic goals vis-a-vis China unless we have Europe on board. I mean, Europe is the second largest economic actor in the world after the United States, and whether it is on putting pressure on China over its non-market economy practices, whether in automobiles or steel or anything else, whether it is in keeping our technological edge over China, where in important technologies like semiconductor tooling and things like that, we have to have, Europe has great expertise and we have to have Europe on board. We're simply not going to be able to achieve our either joint economic goals vis-a-vis China or our joint technological goals vis-a-vis maintaining our edge over China unless the US and Europe are working together. Now, I would posit, and coming from an American perspective, that Europe will benefit in a number of ways from joining in a more hawkish line on China, as we've seen Europe do over the last several years. You know, I look at the overcapacity issue coming out of China, where China has been doubling and tripling down over the last couple of years in manufacturing overcapacity in a number of sectors. What we've seen over the last 2-3 years is Europe is now bearing the brunt of that, whether it's in steel, whether it's now in electric vehicles, and that this Chinese overcapacity is having very adverse impacts on European manufacturing. I think that creates a clear area that we can work together. I also think that as American investors, as American companies look to diversify away from China, that's going to have important beneficial opportunities for Europe. This was a couple of months ago now. I was talking to an executive at a U.S. venture capital fund that has historically invested quite a bit of money in China's high-tech sector. And I asked him, you know, kind of what he'd been up to. And he said, I just got back from a week in Europe because since you guys, by which he meant the Biden administration, which already left, won't let us invest in China anymore, we have to go find startups in Europe to invest in. And so I think that's another area, and I think about the Draghi report where, you know, Europe very much wants to grow its own high-tech industry. And I think that's another area where we can work together very cooperatively as U.S. firms look to diversify away from China. So I actually think what we're going to find is we can neither solve our shared challenges, solve the incoming we face from China, nor can we develop our own kind of economic and technological edge vis-a-vis China unless we are working together.
No, I really appreciate you saying that. Now, I'm going to we've got a lot of things to cover, and I want to get into the econ side, but before that, this importance of seeing the world the same way, I think that's the foundation. It has been the foundation for the last 70 years. I think it's critical going forward. So I'm going to go around and ask you this question about how do you see Ukraine and Taiwan? I mean, do you see it in a similar way or different? I think this is a very important part, and even though you may think it's self-obvious, it's important for this panel and for the American audience because we have a lot of folks who have, on our side, have sort of distinguished the two and told us that we ought to focus on one or the other. And there are a lot of people, me included, who think this is not a one or the other, but a collective issue globally that we need to address globally. So I think it would be important to hear, and I'll start with you, Tate. I mean, nobody's got sort of a more first-hand experience. There's only one person on this panel who sort of kind of lived part of his life under Soviet times and then seen the rest of it and seen going through all the rest and glasnost to Berlin Wall to the Ukraine escapade. And so I think it'd be great to hear your perspective on it and then we'll go right down the same order.
Yes, Gulf, I'm ready to retire. I've seen it all. But yes, no, I've also been in the front lines in Ukraine, and for us it is kind of, I think in the eastern flank of Europe, it is kind of stating the obvious that, you know, we are talking about a globalized world, and we appreciate it all, you know. It started, you know, with economy, then, you know, this technological progress enabled it in a much higher scale. And then all of a sudden we think that you know, actually wars are not global, but they are. And for us, it is absolutely not a question. And what concerns Estonia, whose citizen I am, we've been with our allies US and NATO in absolutely every possible conflict that has taken more global conflict that has taken place during the time that Estonia regained independence. I can assure you that we will be everywhere with you, because this is what we owe to each other, and there is no question for us.
I appreciate it. I think, Gunnar, you've been on the sort of tricky end of this discussion for probably longer than you want to confess in this panel. But I think I appreciate your thoughts on how Europe would see Ukraine and Taiwan, a similar difference where it is.
Well, first to say, Ukraine is an associated partner of the European Union, is a direct neighbor of 4 of our member states, is in a war situation where 25% of its territory have been occupied. We have a massive land war situation on the continent of Europe we haven't seen since the Second World War. There's war in Europe. So that's the sad reality. And it is next to the territory of NATO. And that is, of course, why we also appreciate very much the solidarity and contributions from the US in the support for Ukraine. Too long, I think, both in Europe and the United States, we have seen the specialists of security being the specialists of NATO, being the specialists of Europe. And then we have had the specialists of Asia or the Indo-Pacific. And the two worlds didn't really talk so much with each other. And now there's the realization that we are having a global situation where it is about what are the rules of this world. And nowhere has this been more openly and more frequently expressed than in the frequent meetings between the leadership of the Russian Federation and the leadership of the People's Republic of China. It started with the unlimited, it didn't start, but it was very visible when the friendship without limits was declared 3 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, when President Putin visited Beijing in February 2022. It started earlier, and it has become much more explicit since then. And the common goal is to develop a new world order, supposedly more democratic. And we see that China is fully underwriting the Russian justification of the aggression against Ukraine, while Russia is supporting the positions which China has vis-à-vis the South China Sea, Taiwan, and other issues. So nobody in the US or in Europe should afford anymore to look only at Ukraine or to look only at Taiwan. This is all part of the same overall global equation. And I think that there is need, therefore, for also our political leaders to make sure that we see that we have, you use the term adversary, which I don't use when it comes to China, at least, but that there is a commonality, which is a fundamental challenge to our not only value system, but to our security, and we have to be able to react to this appropriately.
No, I appreciate it, and I think this is a sort of a healthy debate between us, what words to use and my only sort of submission respectfully to my European colleagues would be that we got to use the term that is sort of comparable to the kind of action and the demands which will require to meet it. And so I think both not only from the government, especially from the public, and from the people. So I think rallying the people on a important sort of world-changing event by calling them systemic rival If I was the people, I would find it very uninspiring for me to step up to do anything.
Sorry for interrupting you,
yeah, but please.
The European Union member states who are members of NATO agreed also at the Washington Declaration to characterize the People's Republic of China a decisive enabler of the Russian war effort. So the language has developed further, and that China, with its very significant exports of dual-use goods supporting the modernization of Russian defense industry, has become a decisive enabler of the Russian war effort, is unfortunately nowadays a fact, and has also been clearly mentioned as such by the European allies.
Point well.
I think we need to introduce yet additional dimension to this discussion, why we are supporting Ukraine, why Ukraine is so crucial also for Taiwan security. We have to ask ourselves the question whether we want to see a war as a legitimate way of doing business in international relations again. Since end of 20th century, and that was actually American innovation to the international affairs, we delegitimize war as a tool of doing business. Then, after World War II, we established United Nations, and we embraced exactly the same provision into UN Charter. And Soviet Union, then Russia, subscribed to this view that we don't want to see wars as an appropriate, legitimate way of conducting foreign policy. So when now we refer China as an enabler of Russia in recent NATO communique, first we condemned Russia as a rule breaker, and we, how to say, we communicate to China that we are going to defend the same principle China also subscribed to. China is also a member of United Nations Security Council, which carries a special responsibility for maintaining peace in the world. So if we don't want to see China restoring to force against Taiwan, we have to stop Russia in Ukraine, and we have to defend the basic principle. And I think if we go to the ordinary Chinese people and ask them whether they want to see war as a global phenomenon, as a legal tool in the future, they would say no. So they would be on the same side with us. So my conclusion would be that we need to create or recreate the understanding that we are integrated by common cause, and the peace is the thing all people around the world need.
No, I appreciate it. Miguel, let me come to you now. I think you've been working on this issue of sort of framing to some degree in Europe for a long time. And now, more importantly, I think a shared transatlantic framing of issues. Now, certainly NATO has come along. There's a progression, as Gunnar rightly alluded to. We have in NATO meetings increasingly people coming in from the Indo-Pacific regions. I mean, Japan is there, South Korea is there, Australia is there, New Zealand is there at NATO meetings. I think that rightly, when Ukraine happened, most of the Indo-Pacific partners were one of the first, including even Singapore, who condemned the action and joined the sanction side. So you have very strong solidarity from the Indo-Pacific side towards the European cause, or at least the Ukrainian cause, not European, is a global cause. And I think now you have most probably Prime Minister Ishiba coming in as the new Prime Minister in Japan, who is sort of even earlier has talked about a sort of an Asian version, and I've sort of called it the Indo-Pacific Treaty Organization, but a collective security arrangement in the Indo-Pacific arena. So I think as we go forward, I think it'd be useful for people like yourself in particular, who are in this business of helping the two governments with the framing side, that we frame as the topic of this panel, we frame the interest, our very most basic interest the right way, because framing is important. Matt Pottinger, a good friend of ours, gave a very sort of rather renowned speech now to the Chinese and in Chinese to say, hey, like Confucius said, it's important to call the thing as it is, because without doing so, it's difficult to then really look for solutions and we go forward. So I think we're in a kind of that same point where we need the shared framing of issues so that we don't get dissipated by sort of naysayers on both sides of the Atlantic pitting one over the other. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on.
Thank you, and I think we've come a long way. One of the most recent successes, I think, is that we jointly talk about de-risking, and that the Japanese concept of economic security has become so prevalent across the globe in thinking about our resilience agenda and security issues. But I think this needs to go forward, and language is important. I agree. In Germany and Europe, we have a long debate still waiting for us on the issues around deterrence. It's not a term that we like to use when we speak about China. And also, I think questions related to what is the desired end state of relations with China are quite important. I think you would get Europeans on board with a vision of a somewhat more constrained China in its ambitions, but we probably don't want to contain China in all of what it does. A vision where we jointly somehow try to manage competition with China is one that would get you more buy-in in Europe than one that is basically about negating any chance of China's rise to happen in whatever shape and form. So indeed, that's important, but I think we also need the frameworks and the institutions and the partners to actually get it done. And it's not just about us, it's also about the Global South and what offer we have in place to make our approach to world affairs more convincing. You pointed out that we have a lot of solidarity and condemnation also of the Global South and Asian friends with regard to Ukraine, but not so many joining the sanctions effort. So there's a difference between those matters, and we have a huge task in front of us to make that work.
So let me just talk on that. I think, Pete, when we talk about anything transatlantic, it sort of reeks of some well where the world ends on basically Europe, America, and so it's a very sort of Eurocentric or at least Atlantic-centric discussion. And we're in a world where whether we, let's just call it the Global South or whatever, there's a lot of world outside of just the Europe and America. And as we not only talk about our shared interest, I think we have to do a much better job of sort of sharing a vision for the future that is in line and addresses the aspirations, which I think we've been slow at it at best. And how would you think that's the way for us to sort of engage both from American aspect, but especially Europe, America working on it together to provide a more sort of more optimistic, more aspirational, more forward-looking issue on its own merit, not because it's countering China or Russia, but on its own merit? What's the future that one should be offering and engaging the Global South on?
Well, let me start with what I see as a little bit of the good news here, which is that I think that at a conceptual level over the last couple of years, you have seen a pretty good degree of alignment, both here in Washington, in Brussels, in key European capitals, as well as a couple of other allies, Canadians and Japanese, that we kind of collectively as the industrial Western democracies need to be putting more on the table with key Global South, key emerging markets. You saw that through the G7 format, obviously US and a number of the key European capitals, as well as Canada and Japan. You saw that in G7 format with the announcement of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure investment 2 years ago. You've seen it in the US-EU format through some of the Trade and Technology Council's kind of announcements about the importance of having, connectivity, digital connectivity for the global South. So I think that the good news is there's large agreement across capitals that we need to be doing more here. The bad news is, on the flip side, we haven't actually figured out the tools to make this happen in a very real and meaningful way. And I think, if you talk even to political figures who've been involved in these initiatives, they would all admit, at least privately, that yes, while the frameworks are good and the rhetoric is good, actually getting resources to the table to create deals, whether it's in telecoms, whether it's in critical minerals, whether it's in physical infrastructure, we just haven't really lived up to the ambition. And so I think the challenge and the opportunity over the next couple of years, kind of regardless of who wins the US election in whatever it is, 36, 37 days, and as the new European Commission commissioners settle in, is going to be, okay, we have a couple of tools, on the US side, it's things like DFC and USAID. In Europe, they have various national and European Union institutions. How do we actually get these guys working together to galvanize those resources, to actually identify some shared projects to invest in and get that done? And so it's really the kind of translating vision into operations is what we need to be focused on over the next couple of years.
I'm going to ask you a question now, Pete, again, and we're going to go in the reverse order. I think that the crux of the matter a lot is about economic relationship between US and EU. You alluded to it in your opening comments. I would say that in an economic competition with China, I think one can arguably make the point that for America, EU is an indispensable partner, and for the EU, America is an indispensable partner in engaging China on very non-market, market-distorting, mercantilist policies. And so to that end, there are tremendous amount of sort of high side of working together, but there are also lots of sort of pitfalls and landmines, and where we may be so engaged among each other, putting tariffs on one another, that we may miss the bigger boat in being able to rallying together. So I'd like to sort of hear from you. How do you frame sort of both a realistic but a promising view, at the same time being aware of how it can be derailed? I think it'd be good to hear from you, and then we go around and ask other people for the remaining time, because that's the crux of the matter that both administrations will be dealing with.
Yeah, I think we have to be realistic. Look, there have always been bumps in the transatlantic economic relationship, including over the last couple of years. I think, after the American Congress passed and President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, I think a number of folks in the Biden administration had to spend, 6 or 12 months afterwards sort of figuring out a path forward so that it did not alienate our allies in Europe. And I think you saw that. The Biden administration do a couple of things there to try to get through that point of tension. One is explain the reasons and the justifications for it to our European colleagues, but another was to make some compromises in implementation. They actually wrote some rules on things like electric vehicles to try to be a little bit more inclusive of Europe. And I think we just need to be realistic. There will be those bumps. I certainly think, and I served in the Biden administration, not the Trump administration, so I say that sort of a caveat or background. Look, I think big new tariffs on the European Union by the United States would be counterproductive to this agenda. I just think there's no way around that, and I hope we don't get to that point. But even if we don't have tariffs, there will be bumps in our relationship, whether it's on digital tech regulation, whether it's on other subsidy issues. I think the key for making sure those bumps don't define the relationship is twofold. One is kind of continuously being reminded by our political leadership and reminding our political leadership of what the big picture is, that we cannot take on the collective challenge we face from China. We also can't grow our own economies to their potential unless we cooperate on these economic issues. So you got to keep kind of getting up out of the weeds and reminding ourselves of the big picture. And then the second is kind of, as we saw with the IRA, being willing to make some tactical concessions to each other and sort of, in good faith, figure out how you, on the challenges between us, get to some compromises that address what both sides need so that we can then pivot back to that big picture framework that should be guiding our work.
Big picture, small issues, I mean, core issues, peripheral issues. How the framing going on the European front, Mika? And same thing.
Look, as I said, trade is central. So I think we need to have a shared trade agenda. TTC over the past 4 years has not delivered to the extent that I think both sides might have hoped for it. And we failed to get to some agreements where I think at the end of the day, both administrations wanted to have some on green steel, etc. So there's a shared agenda that needs to be developed and needs to make functionable. But the bigger question is indeed how, across different sectors, we are going to create trade frameworks where, among like-minded partners with similar economic systems, we have shared principles that allow us to build clubs. Because the current world where a country that is working with a fundamentally different economic system is integrating deep and penetrating deep into our economic systems is not sustainable. So this means sectoral agreements, specific principles around sustainability, around national security, around fair competition, they have to be built, and that's a huge task moving forward.
Now, so Slavik, to you, I think again, Poland has been kind of on the forefront with Finland, perhaps on both having a defense budget of size, but I think also defense production. I mean, meeting up not only the European needs, but perhaps even if there was a need on the Indo-Pacific side. So I'd like to hear another promising area for the US-Europe, US-EU, and NATO sort of collaboration is the sort of building up of the defense capability, manufacturing capability of Europe. And I think it'd be nice to see what role do you think, what's the realistic nature of it, what role you would play in sort of reaffirming the transatlantic solidarity? Because I think from the President Trump side, I mean, if you got to sort of whistle down his sort of foreign policy, one is that, allies ought to carry their weight. I think it's an important element of it, and whether it be in the trade side or on the defense side. So I think, and the other one is sort of no new wars. So the only way you can prevent no new wars is by deterrence, that you are so much stronger than the other side that they would not try to get to war. The most dangerous part of the war is when you're an equipoise, and that's when war happens, when the other side thinks that they can get one over you. So within that construct, as we are dealing with, and as the situation between China and Russia, where they're doing very close sort of defense production now and in the future design of it, I think it'd be great to hear from you as to where you see US-Europe is headed. Yeah.
First point, we need to boost our military production, and it's true for the United States, it's true for Europe, and we need to do it quickly. Because if any adversary sees our side as weaker or incapable to produce what is needed for contemporary war, it could serve as an incentive. And our common cause is to prevent a major war, either in the Pacific or in Europe. So that's clear. How we can do that? As I said, we need to start, generate more capabilities. Second, I believe that we need to think about common strategy, also in terms of boosting our industry potential. So here is a difficult balance: how much we cooperate, how much we compete. About competition, I think that we are facing a kind of the policy dilemma now. How we are going to respond to the China challenge. Whether go to the defensive, it means restoring to tariffs, restoring to protectionism, or to go offensive. Generate or reinvigorate our technological edge, working together, and re-establishing the sense of our strategic community, that we, on both sides of the pond, first can overcompete others, that working together would make us stronger. And if we start doing defense, particularly separately on our own, that could create additional incentive to go against them one by one. So I think that this incentive is quite, there's a quite long list of incentive for cooperation and for going for offensive. If we are talking about my region, I mean the countries of NATO Eastern flank, there's there is additional thing we can do. It's to invest in our dual-use infrastructure. So Free Seas initiative can be again reinvigorated under any new administration, and as we discussed today, there is a quite good opportunity to use this institutional framework to find a way for cooperation with the others outside of the transatlantic area. It could be India, could be Japan, could be South Korea, could be Australia. Because there is no other way how we can prevent Russia from going further. Staying together, invest in our capabilities, invest in our industry, and work together to maintain and even develop our technological age.
So on technology, when I come to you, Gunnar, I mean, I think you've been kind of one of the leaders on talking about how US, Europe can come together on particularly on standards for sort of future and advanced technology. And I think there's some really good work and promising stuff going on in AI and others. So I think it'd be great to hear your perspective on where we are at, where we are headed, and what are the pluses on this going forward.
Let me first agree with Peter and also with Miko, who already gave a number of elements for transatlantic intensified cooperation. This can, however, go right in the wrong direction at the very beginning if we talk about imposition of tariffs between transatlantic partners. So there is a huge range of concrete issues we can engage with, and particularly the setting of standards in new technologies which you are referring to. And this goes from electric vehicles and many other areas important for green transition to the digital area, and to biotech, and to nanotech, and to quantum computing, and in particular also to artificial intelligence. There's a lot of work which has already been done in the context of the Trade and Technology Council, but we could take this to a new quality by agreeing on standards which would be the same or would be mutually recognized on both sides of the Atlantic. This would also help to set global standards once such transatlantic standards would exist. And I think the understanding where each other side is, what are the needs of industry, has very much developed over the last few years under the Trade and Technology Council, but the decisions to move towards the standard setting in concrete terms, in legally binding terms, in concrete terms for industry has not yet advanced as much as it could be. If there was also an element of tariff liberalization, of easing trade, whether it's trade in goods or trade in services, that could be a very important additional incentive for our industries on both sides, which face, of course, a very massive, fast innovating competition from China and also from some other partners. in the world economy, and we cannot close our eyes. We will be faster and better prepared for such competition by agreeing on common standards and by facilitating the business for our companies. If you allow me, I would like to add one other element, which Peter also referred to, responding to your question. That's the Global South. I think this is not enough looked at. There has to be a capacity which has developed somehow over the last few years in the context of G7 and certainly in the context of G20, because there, of course, Global South is, I would say, the majority part. And African Union was recently added to G20. But also the G7 outreach to partners in the Global South is promising. We have to do much more in terms of easing the burden of debt, in terms of the need to finance investments to deal with climate change. And yes, with the reform of the United Nations system, and yes, with the reform of the international financial institutions. If we continue to look in another direction, it will just get worse. And those who say that they stand for the democratization of the international system will continue to become more and more popular. So my plea would be that as part of the future transatlantic cooperation, we include also these Global South related specific subjects.
Okay. We've got 5 minutes. We'll do a quick round to sort of get the last thoughts. I'll start with you, Tiit. I mean, you told me a very moving story when we were working together on trusted connectivity and how in Soviet times you'd go all the way down to the Lithuanian-Latvian border to get a radio so you can hear the voice of America. And that on occasions in Europe now that perhaps a voice which had a certain amount of sort of timber to it and almost a sort of a inspiring sort of element to it that may be missing. So I think it's good to hear what would that sound like today? What would that shape it should be? I think it'd be good to hear from you, and then do a quick round, and you can answer this as well.
Maybe I say to our younger audience that Voice of America was a radio broadcast that was financed by the US government to sort of inform the people behind the Iron Curtain and give them hope, and it was really, really important. But life has made me a little bit less nostalgic and more practical. So to somehow conclude, I think we also have to keep in mind that the total consistency in foreign policy, and especially in a strange branch called trade policy, is not possible. So we can't overreact in this. But meantime, just as we recognize that there were just elections either coming or there were elections. Of course, there is multiple of other elections, but in this context, the important elections are soon done or already over, and so we have a little bit time. So I think the most important thing is not to rush into something, and not to rush into some sort of trade war, if we say it frankly, because it can escalate to something that is breaking, our relation for a very long time. And therefore, I think it is really important, as already mentioned here, that there has been a progress on TTC. So the work for now is kind of concluded. Conclusions are done. But what concerns our biggest challenges and our possible cooperation there, it is quite well phrased in this document. So we have the freshest one. So my ask to all the partners, my people in EU and in the US, that don't rush into something, and let's build in the platforms and make them better that we already have.
So on that theme, very quickly, I go around and end up with Pete, but start from Gunnar. Tell me the areas working together, what you think is the most promising area, just one or two, but just so let's leave it on an optimistic note that this is the most promising area for us to be working on together, as Tiit rightly called us to do. Gunnar?
Well, I think most promising and most important for the competitiveness of our international competitiveness of our economies are the new technologies. we have to focus on them. So in other words, let's not just talk about steel and aluminum, as important as they are. Let me add to this that I think what is also important for our breathless democracies to be able to think global, to think long term, and to act in a holistic way, meaning bringing different strands of policy together.
Nico, we're running out of time, so go ahead. Give me the promising area.
We do not just have a shared interest in shaping the future of globalization, but also we have an interest in the success of our companies, vice versa. So I think that's absolutely central. Making sure that our companies have a transatlantic marketplace for the development of green new technologies, but also in the old industries is absolutely critical, and I think we have a lot of work to do there.
Slavic?
We should not be afraid. We should not be afraid of winning. We should not be afraid of competition. We can overcompete our competitors, and if we are attacked, we are going to win.
Pete, you got the last word. How you trump that?
I don't have a good way of trumping that. I'll just make two comments where I see reasons for optimism. One, which already came up, is the new technologies. You know, the sort of AI, quantum, things where we don't have a ton of entrenched business interests and different standards on both sides of the Atlantic, and we can kind of write rules together. I think that's one. The other is defense industrial base issues. You know, I think the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, and then the risk of war in Asia has made us realize the importance across the Atlantic of having a strong defense industrial base. And there's clearly a lot of desire on both sides to rebuild it. There's obviously going to be increased spending, which provides a nice sort of tailwind to doing it. And I think that's an area we could work together.
Okay, well, thanks. This is a very rich discussion, just scratching the surface. Hopefully Atlantic Council will be holding this more regularly as we go forward and shaping it. A big round of applause to our very esteemed and experienced panel.